Thanks everyone for joining. I'm just getting our guest on. There we go. Let's see if this works. Fingers crossed. Hello all. Thank you for joining. Hey,
Hi.
how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
So
I
exciting.
It is exciting. I'm very, very excited. This is when I just saw the request to join and thinking about the things that you cover, the topics you cover, the books that you've spoken about, I was like, yeah, this is something that I definitely want to contribute to and be a part of.
Oh no, it was so exciting because just to explain, we've actually met each other on Albright, which is obviously a different platform.
Yes,
And it's
yes.
like a empowerment, women's empowerment platform essentially, which is really cool actually to be able to do that and then just come onto Instagram and do something completely different, which is really cool.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, so again, huge thanks for actually agreeing to doing this because obviously this is such a weird request I had on Albright, which was like, discussing these kind of really important books. And I love your recommendation. So, yeah, just I'm going to quickly explain. So, I want to say Dr. Joy is a multidisciplinary teacher, an ever evolving student, which is like an excellent slogan, an excellent catchphrase generally. And the book, obviously, you've recommended is 11 Rings, which is The Soul of Success by Hugh Delahanty and Phil Jackson, which obviously, for some people who don't know about it, Phil Jackson actually won more championships than any coach in the
Yeah.
history of professional sports for
Mhm.
the NBA. And he was the coach for the Chicago Bulls and the Los Angeles Lakers, leading the likes of Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and Shaquille O'Neal. So that was just from learning from the book because I'm from the UK and we don't get the NBA as
Right,
such.
right.
But I knew those names. I definitely knew those names. And I was like, these guys are big deals. So I was like, whoa, so this guy must be like huge. So
Yeah.
first, yeah, I was like, first of all, what did you feel were your key takeaways from this book, anyways?
Yeah, so I grew up as an athlete, right? I didn't play basketball, even though a lot of people thought I should because I'm very tall. But I grew up as an athlete, so I'm always fascinated by the stories of athletes and their journeys and how they find the will to succeed and push through and all of those things, right? And so for Phil Jackson to be, to your point, the coach of some of the biggest names in sports, even in countries where they don't even get the NBA, but you know
Yeah,
those names, right? And so I
yeah.
was like, okay, what must it have been like for him as, a leader and an inspiration in those spaces? And so my takeaway with it being, the soul of success, for me, my takeaway was that the success is really about a willingness to transform from the inside out, right? It's not
Mm,
something that we can manufacture, it is revealed through a journey of self examination and just the capacity and the will to adapt to whatever the moment requires of you, right? So throughout that story, we've heard about him recovering from injury as a player,
yeah.
recovering from, the divorce of his college sweetheart and what that meant, and then transitioning from player to coach and what that was like. And so we've seen him evolve all these ways and how he responded to what the season of his life that he was in, what it required of him, and how he continued to adapt and how he continued to be willing to examine himself at each step of that journey. And how that, I think, at least my takeaway from the book, was what contributed to the ultimate success, which we saw, right, as spectators of basketball and sports. So it's really about that willingness to examine yourself and to evolve and to adapt to what the moment requires of you.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it was incredible and it was so poignant, like watching, like reading about it, obviously since, Kobe Bryant's death. And, I was
Sure.
just like, wow, he learned so much. You could see him evolving and growing up as a person in the
Yes.
book as well,
Yes.
which was really interesting because
Yes.
obviously they had a quite tenuous
Mhm.
relationship, Phil Jackson and Kobe Bryant. But, and
Mhm.
for you, how much do you think it was a challenge for Jackson to build like a proper team in terms of the Chicago Bulls, because he was trying something completely different in terms of bringing Eastern philosophy into Western kind of sports. Very fascinating.
Yes, yes, yes. And to your point, he was bringing perspectives and practices that were very decentralized in the world of sports, and particularly in a city like Chicago, right? Where when we're talking about those big names, right? Michael Jordan and Horace Grant and all, Dennis Rodman, all these people
Mm.
that he was coaching at the time. Um, when you think about how we tend to sort of revere and celebrate athletes in these ways, what he was bringing, this sense of humility and stillness, was very different. And so I
Mm.
imagine that, and as he shared in the book, I think some of the biggest challenges was presenting that in a way that the athletes would be willing to integrate it into their understanding of the
Mm.
game, and then to be able to do so in a manner that as a collective led to what they all intended to do, which was win championships, right?
Yeah.
And so how do I introduce these perspectives and practices that are so far from the world that I am in right now? But I also know, and I'm speaking now as a person who's sort of taking on the responsibility, I also know how powerfully
Yeah.
transformative these practices and perspectives can be, and how relevant they are, even if they're not necessarily typically at the forefront of this world and in this sort of context. So I think the challenge was figuring out a way to do that, um, so that the athletes and frankly the franchise, right? Because it's not just the athletes; it's getting everybody on board,
Yeah.
right? To practice these types of practices and approaches. So I think the challenge was doing so in a way that could convince them to integrate it, because it was very much in alignment with what they intended to do, just from a different perspective and a new approach.
Yeah, it was so interesting because like he was getting them to read books and which
Mm-hmm.
obviously is so unusual. It's like books that
Mm-hmm.
might like affect them. And I was like, do you think connecting to something beyond the individual goals could be like a great source of power? So
Yeah.
trying to create, it's true because just even in terms of soccer, like there are soccer teams where they focus on individual players to be like everything for the team.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, is the team more than the individual?
Yeah. So in the book, Phil Jackson talks about his days as a player and the early days as a high school player. And he spoke about this synergistic interconnectedness that he would experience as a part of this team, and how every time he stepped on the court, he was really in pursuit of that feeling, that experience of feeling so deeply, and he used the word transcendent, right? This connection being so transcendent to his teammates and to the game and
Mm.
to their greater purpose and their intention to perform well, right? Like he felt this profound, deep connection to that, and that each time he stepped on the court, it was that he was looking for, which is a very
Mm.
different intention from trying to pad your stats as an individual and trying to get yourself a highlight reel, or to get,
Yeah.
on the top 10 plays of the day or whatever it is, right? Like that's a very different intention. And so he spoke about this synergy being his drive. And eventually that led him to being, even at that young age, the MVP of the team, right? And so for me, of course, you work hard, you do the things you need to do to hone your craft, right? But that even in doing that, you're doing so that when you're in the spirit of the game, you're not focused on the details of how to dribble, how to shoot, how to do this or that,
Mm.
but you're allowed to be fully open to what is unfolding in real time. And then again, creating space to be able to adapt to what the moment requires, because you're not so focused on the details of how do I perform, how do I do this, what is my best angle,
Mm.
or whatever the things are that you can get caught up in when you're tied up in the idea of your individual game and how you're performing in a given moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely, completely.
Yeah, yeah.
It was. it was just like I remember like in my head the way I kind of saw it was that like how a pianist can
Mhm.
learn something so well that they don't even think about the notes anymore, isn't
Right,
it? It's that's
right.
it. It's the feeling around it. And I was just like, this is kind of what he was trying to do, transcend.
Yes, yes, yes,
It's fascinating. I was like, wow, this is
mhm,
really quite
yeah.
deep. And do you think or do you believe you need to create the right environment for oneness to grow and then nurture it carefully every day?
Mm. Yeah, so again, going back to the book, Phil Jackson spoke about his time playing for the New York Knicks, right? So fast forward from high school now into his professional playing days. And he spoke about playing for the New York Knicks and while also in the transition of life around other things, right? Coming back from an injury, so trying to get recovered. Also, again,
Mm,
recovering from the divorce from his college sweetheart. Just like all these things are happening, and he's playing at the highest level for this particular sport. And he said, you know, when I was in New York, I would feel kind of lost because I didn't have that connection to nature, right? I'm in this big city, all these buildings. I didn't have that connection to nature. When I think about this connection to nature and you know, we don't have to do anything for nature to grow and thrive the way that it's meant to, right? Like we don't have to do
mm,
anything for that to happen. What we, I think, more than doing something is the resistant is resisting or refraining from interrupting nature's process,
mm,
right? And so it's not what we do, it's sort of this idea of how do I not interrupt what is already divinely going to happen, right?
mm,
And so in the same way, when you're asking this question about, you know, do we have to sort of create or cultivate this space for oneness to occur, I think no. I think what we have to
mm,
do is not try to rush it or not try to manipulate it or not try to anticipate it, but instead to receive it, accept it, to allow it, and then adapt to it, not resist it, right? And I think that's when the oneness occurs, when we can accept what is and allow it, and then trust ourselves to adapt and integrate and flow with it. And so it's really less doing and more being, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. It's so interesting because, like, oh yeah, I'm just quickly recapping. We're discussing the book 11 Rings by Phil Jackson, who's considered one of the greatest coaches of all time, especially for the NBA. But
Mhm.
just a fascinating man and very, very intelligent man.
Yeah.
And as we were talking about sort of the oneness of a team, and I was just wondering in terms of, you know, they were discussing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Obviously, this is
Mhm.
like you see this across everything, management and all sorts of
Sure,
things, right?
sure.
So, you know, they say the highest human need is to achieve self-actualization, which I
Mhm.
think he defines as the full use and exploitation of one's talents, capabilities, or sorry, capacities and potentialities. Now,
Mhm.
do you agree with that? Do you think self-actualization is the highest human need?
Okay, so let me preface this by saying I am a therapist, and this is something that is introduced in our graduate school
Yeah.
programs, in our theories, and all of that. And so some of my peers who may see this at some point might cringe at what I'm about to say because it's so sort of ingrained in us, this idea, right? And so, what I'll say is, I think that self actualization is a necessary step, but I
Mm,
don't necessarily agree that it is the highest, right?
mm,
Like, it's not like it's the highest need or thing that we can strive for. I think that, you know, as human beings, we know ourselves and understand ourselves in the context of our relationships and the people that we
mhm,
are surrounded by. And so, if we're going to talk about the highest point or need of a human being, we can't do so outside of the context of our communities, right? And
mm,
so I think that self actualization, more than it is the height, I think it is the foundation for then moving towards a more collective actualization, for cultural legacy and perpetuity, right? Like, it's that we know ourselves so that we can begin to, and to the point of, Maslow's definition of sort of exploiting those gifts and talents in the world for the greater good of the collective is what I believe. For, the community, for the larger of us, right? And then, because again, as human beings, we're not just individuals who exist in this vacuum and we only sort of are to ourselves. We know ourselves more fully through our relationships. And so to be able to self-actualize for the purpose of a collective actualization, which then recycles back to helping us more deeply understand ourselves, and it becomes this sort of cyclical mutuality between ourselves and the communities in which we live, and that we actualize so that we can more fully actualize as a collective, and we continue to do that. And I think that is really, in my understanding of humanity and what it means to exist here, much higher. To do that and to strive for that is a much higher calling than sort of sticking with and staying in my own private little bubble to actualize just as an individual, right? And so I think I don't disagree with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I just think that it's not complete. I'll say that.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I totally agree. And I'm sure, I think a lot of people also have adapted the Maslow's
Sure.
model quite a lot recently as well. So definitely. We do have a question underneath. I'll get back to you in a second because I think people are obviously very interested in the subject as well. So, and I was just wondering, so obviously we were talking about the Eastern practices that he introduced to the Chicago Bulls, like meditation,
Mhm.
mindfulness, and even yoga. And how useful do you think that was for them?
Oh man. So I remember when I read the book, like one of the first things that really landed for me, and I just remember thinking like, oh, this is about to get good. Like, is, Phil Jackson spoke about his drive as a coach, right? And he said like some people are really obsessed with winning, and some
Mm,
coaches really love seeing themselves on TV. But he said for me, and this is kind of mirroring what he said about himself as a player years prior, right? But he
mm,
said, for me as a coach, it's really about watching the guys tap into this magic that occurs when you are fully and wholeheartedly, like from the depths of your soul, committed to something greater than yourself, right? And he said,
mm,
once you experience that, you can't go back, right? Like you can't unknow that
mm,
experience, right? And so that is what you achieve through mindfulness, through meditation, through the practices that he was introducing. And so what he was really offering his players was not just, the expectations for how to perform as a player, but he was offering them the experience for how to transform as a person. And
mm,
that goes so far beyond, the moment you take your uniform off at the end of the game. And so if a regular basketball season is 82 games and you're doing that, you're striving for this sense of, again, transcendence and tapping into the magic of having a collective goal. And you're doing that through the practices on and off the court that you engage in as a team over the span of 82 games. If you're doing that each game, absolutely, you're going to see, that's going to continue to compound in your
mm.
results, which is what we saw, right? This is why he's one of he is the winningest coach across sports, not just basketball, but across
Yeah.
sports. And I think that it is a product of not just, again, the performance of the player, but the transforming of the
Mm,
person, which then got to step into the role of a player. And then we see him getting multiple three-peats, right? Across over and over again across decades doing this. This is not something that is accidental, I think.
no. Definitely. Yeah, it was amazing that how he managed to transform, but also like adapt quite a
Yeah.
lot of his sort of strategies towards the different teams, because obviously Chicago Bulls was very different to the LA Lakers, but then somehow he managed to kind of understand that this is a different situation, we need to adapt it to this. And actually, and it was interesting, I think he talks a bit about, which is non-action. isn't it?
Yeah.
And I was like, do you think we can solve most problems through non-action?
Yeah. So, um, if I were to kind of break this down briefly, right? So, action is doing.
Mm,
So then for me, non-action, going back to an earlier point I made, is then being, right? And so I not only can we solve problems through non-action, I think that we already do.
mm,
And whether we know it or not, right? Because we can only do from our deepest understanding of who we are, right? And so we have to pass through that non-action stage. And so for me, non-action is really just consciously tapping into and centering what is my deepest understanding of who I am, and then
mm,
choosing to act from that place. And so we have to pass through this sense of non-action, the tapping into who am I, how am I being in the world, before we can move into, and then how am I choosing to then show up and act and respond to the events and experiences that are unfolding around me, right? And so I think,
mm,
can we, but we actually already are, and it's just a matter of to what level of consciousness is that occurring.
yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
yeah, sometimes we're not even aware of doing these things. So yeah, that's true. And I think he also says, Jackson says, the soul of success is surrendering to what is like radical acceptance, which I thought was like radical acceptance. And I was just wondering, how do you feel about that? Do you think that's the best way to go, which is just to surrender as it kind of like an extension to non-action?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
mm,
And so surrendering is not passive, right?
mm,
And I think in cultures that really center hard work as the cornerstone to success, this idea of surrender can feel very, we can be very like reluctant to even explore what that is for us. But if you've ever had to surrender your idea or your hope or your thought or your vision for how something would go, because as it turns out, it wasn't quite going that way, and you had to really kind of surrender to what actually was happening. Again, this radical sense of acceptance about what is happening
mm,
right here, versus my idea of what I thought should be happening, right? Um, then you know that that is, if you've ever had to do that, right? If you've ever had a vision in your mind for how something was going to go, and then you had to surrender to the truth of what was actually happening, and again, adapt and pivot according to what the moment or the situation required. If you've ever had to experience that, then you know that that is a very beautifully remarkable and powerful, um, just soul stirring trust in the unknown, right?
mm,
And to achieve that in any context is really to allow yourself to be divinely inspired to act. So it's different from just inaction, right? Non-action is different from inaction, which I think is really just
mm,
being stagnant or paralyzed and doing nothing. I think non-action is more, at least my interpretation of it, is more in the realm of like divinely inspired action. So not doing things for the sake of doing them, but doing them because you
mm,
feel like there's a clear connection between this action and the inspired outcome that you want to experience. And surrendering to that feeling instead of trying to get caught up in the doing of the steps that we think we have to do to achieve
mm,
success, the things that we've been told are required to
yeah.
achieve success, but really sort of leaning into there's something else that I'm being called to, a different way, a different path. Hence, we're talking about Phil Jackson, who was called in the NBA like the Zen master, right? Because you've seen in sports, coaches are like on the sidelines, ripping their hair out, going crazy, screaming.
Yeah.
And he was like, he would just be like sitting there. You're like, sub them out. They're not winning. They're doing horribly. And he would just be like sitting there watching them, and they're gonna figure it out. And it was very much a radically different approach to coaching, especially at that elite level of professional sport.
Yeah.
So I think that is a sign of surrender. And again, we've seen how that played out across his career, not only as a coach, but also as a player, right? And so I think if that is his metric by which he measures success, then I think that is
Mm.
fantastic.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah. It is inspired. It really is inspired. And
Yeah.
like, so I'm like, what would you give it out of 5 stars? What rating would you give this book?
Yeah. So I'm always going, when thinking about books, I'm going in 3 categories, right? There's information, like can I follow a trail of research and references from your book that if I
Mm,
further my understanding of this topic, right? So there's information, there's application. How relevant is this to me? Is there something practical I can take and apply to my life after
yeah.
I read this book? And then there's transformation. Like, is there something in this book that causes me to show up differently in the world? Right.
Mm,
So for me, if I were to give this on a scale of 1 to 5, information, maybe like a 2, right? This is more like this
interesting.
personal story. There aren't references where I'll go read this book and
No, no,
go get the
you're
book of
right.
that person, right? So maybe like a 2. Application, more like a 4, right? Because he gives
Mm,
very clear ideas about how he approached coaching and leadership that feel very applicable for me. So I gave it a 4. And then transformation, I gave it a 5 completely
I
because
love it.
I still reference, I've read this book years ago, but I still reference it when I step into new roles of leadership and think about
Mm,
how can I, in the same way that he had to do, figure out how to take this philosophy or idea that I have and convince people, enroll them into this vision using techniques or approaches that may not be typical for the world we're in or the work we're doing. And how do I get to do that? Using practices that I know will serve them far beyond what it is we're trying to do with whatever the goal is that we're working on, right? So in terms of transformation, it completely transformed how I approach leadership when I work with teams on different projects, right? And so overall, if I were to tally up all those scores, I think it lands somewhere in the range of like 3 and 3/4 stars, we'll say, is what I
no,
would give
yeah.
on
It's
5, yeah, out of 5.
I like it. It's realistic. It's realistic. It like, it's not like a perfect book, but there's parts of it where you could definitely relate to, which
Sure.
I think, yeah, that makes total sense. And I think in that way, I totally feel the same about it as well, because exactly there were no references. He didn't really talk about anyone else in it.
Sure.
He
Sure.
was just sort of like, I picked this up. I'm like, I liked this and that and this, but didn't actually talk about anyone else's books or anything that
Mm.
he read. But yeah, no, I like that. I like that. 3.25 stars then for the book. But I think still a rave review,
Yes, yes,
despite yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh man, that was amazing. Thank you so much for
Thank
speaking with
you.
me. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
There was one question I think below, which was very interesting, which was, is oneness the same as unity and teamwork?
Hmm. Off the top of my head, what initially comes to me as a distinction between those two concepts is that unity speaks to working as a unit, which I think inherently acknowledges that we are individuals working as a unit,
Mm,
versus oneness for me speaks to more of an integrated identity of
right.
like
Mm,
sameness, right? And so I think they're cousins. The concepts are cousins and certainly related. But like, if we were to really take a deep dive, the way that I would sort of conceptualize oneness is more about an integrated identity, whereas unity feels more like um, a collaborative approach.
mm, yeah.
That's just like what immediately comes to mind, and I'm sure if we were to dive into a deeper conversation, things would come up. But that's what immediately comes to mind as a way that I might make a distinction between the two ideas.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that. I feel like there's a certain homogeneity, isn't it, with oneness,
Yeah.
more than unity.
Mhm.
But yeah, and speaking of collaboration, so thank you for this one. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's so exciting. I love meeting people off all these platforms and actually chatting to them. So yeah. Yeah, but please do keep in touch. And if you have any other books in the future, please come back because I think this was fantastic. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. I was already going like, oh, I should have said this book. Oh man, what about that book? And so certainly if there's an opportunity to come back and do this again, I would love to have another conversation with you as I am a fan of books and sharing ideas about them. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you. I can't wait to speak to you again then with your other books then.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Awesome. See you, Joy. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.